We left off discussion last week of World War One, and as we did, we were talking about the failed efforts by the U.S. President Woodrow Wilson to include the United States and involve the United States in his own international organization known as the League of Nations. But we also talked about, and as you saw even more so in the documents, particularly from a senator from the state of Massachusetts, Henry Cabot Lodge, there were a lot of opponents of this idea of involvement in the League of Nations. So therefore, as it turned out at the end of World War I, the United States, despite the best efforts of Woodrow Wilson, never became involved in this League of Nations. And therefore, the United States would end or come out of World War I as an isolationist nation. We were clearly an isolationist nation. We were going to focus on our own, what turned out in the 1920s to be vibrant prosperity, at least until all of that would falter. And of course, you would have the Great Depression, as we talked about in the second part of last week's lecture. But nonetheless, here I want to start talking about World War II, because all of these issues, foreign and domestic, are related. How so? Well, if you remember when we were talking about the Great Depression, I showed that chart that looked at the unemployment levels from, I believe it was 1929 until 1941. And as we looked at it, we noticed that unemployment levels finally dipped precipitously in 1941. And as I described in passing, that was due largely to the changes in America's involvement in another foreign war, and that was World War II. So we are going to talk about these events that ran up to 1941 as we talk about World War II here, because again, this will help the United States get out of the Great Depression. Another point I want to make in connecting this to previous lectures. If you also remember, after World War I, we talked about the signing of the Treaty of Versailles that was signed by the United States, Great Britain, France, Germany, among others. Well, that treaty was important for several reasons that I already mentioned. First of all, it forced Germany to take sole responsibility for starting World War I. But beyond that, it also took a big chunk of Germany's land and also an even bigger chunk of its money with reparations. So as I alluded to in that lecture on World War I, this would have important ramifications for Germany, because now a lot of German military leaders and nationalists, people like General Erich Ludendorff and people like Adolf Hitler, they would use this idea that German leaders of this new Weimar Republic, as it was known as, stabbed the people in the back and made their nation weak. So therefore, people like Hitler and other nationalists stood up and said, we need to make Germany great again. And therefore, Hitler would eventually rise to power in 1933, and he would seek to restore Germany to greatness. And in the process, he would involve the world in what we have here as World War II. Not long after Hitler rose to power in 1933, he would begin the process of remilitarization, building up his military. And what we'll see beginning in 1936 and 1937 on is he will begin to take back those nations and those areas of land that were taken away from Germany at the end of World War I. Now here's the thing. How did this eventually spiral out of control and become World War II? Two reasons, historians argue. First of all, the lack of influence and power of the League of Nations, largely because the United States was not involved. And that, in fact, is a second point that I want to highlight here, because here you have one of the most powerful nations economically, at least prior to the Great Depression, seeing itself and finding itself in the 1930s as also one of the world's leading isolationist nations. Why? Well, we're going to begin here with this Nye Committee and its so-called Merchants of Death, because what we will see here is the following. From 1934 until 1936, Senator Gerald P. Nye of North Dakota held a series of hearings on the role of bankers and weapons makers in World War I. The Nye Committee, as it was known after its chairman, Gerald P. Nye, concluded that these merchants of death, as he called them, the bankers and the arms makers, had pushed the United States to involve itself in World War I so that the arms dealers and banks could profit. If you remember, this is very reminiscent, this argument that World War I benefited the banks and the weapons makers, to what George Norris said in his speech in the run-up to World War I. George Norris, another Midwestern progressive, just like Gerald P. Nye, basically now saying that same thing here during his committee hearings and eventual report in 1936. But most importantly, in response to this Nye Committee report, Congress passed a series of neutrality acts. And these neutrality acts prohibited loans and credit to nations involved in the fighting, as well as the sale of war material to these belligerents. And this is again a direct response to what happened in World War I. The idea was that what brought us into that first conflict was our continued involvement. Even though we were ostensibly a neutral nation in World War I, we continued to trade, especially with Great Britain and the Allies, and therefore that constant involvement would eventually lead to us being attacked by the German unrestricted submarine warfare. These neutrality acts aim to keep the United States, in fact, out of this war as a true neutral nation. Isolationist sentiment, in fact, was so strong in 1938 that Congress discussed a constitutional amendment that year that would have required the American people to vote on U.S. involvement in foreign wars. Nothing came of this, but the fact that there was talk of that there was talk of a constitutional amendment just shows you that this was not some underground, low-level effort to keep the United States out of war. There were very powerful, influential politicians and other world leaders and national leaders who were saying the United States should stay out. Well, Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States during this time, did not agree with this neutrality, and he would do very much in the several years before Pearl Harbor to ensure that the United States maybe didn't necessarily set foot in Europe. He was adamant that he did not want, if you want to use the terminology here, American boys fighting in Europe. But nonetheless, he attempted to slowly chip away at these neutrality acts to help his ally, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And what we will see is by 1940, isolationism was on its last leg, but it still put up a fight. With Britain's survival in peril, Franklin Roosevelt instituted the first peacetime draft in history. He also donated what he described as these surplus weapons and supplies to the British. Basically, what Franklin Roosevelt did during this time was he used the analogy of a house that has a hose attached to it. And he says this house with a hose has as its next door neighbor a house that is on fire. And therefore, basically what Franklin Roosevelt said was, if your neighbor's house is on fire and you had a fire hose laying around, wouldn't you use it? And that's the same logic that he said applied to providing Great Britain with these so-called surplus items. But in addition to this, you would also see the United States reach an agreement with Great Britain. And this was the Destroyers for Bases deal that you see up on the screen, listed on the screen. And what this involved was the United States giving Great Britain 50 old destroyers in exchange for naval bases in Canada, the Bermuda, and the Philippines. So therefore, we see now American influence expanding abroad. By giving these so-called old destroyers, they are now gaining bases abroad because of this deal. Well, the only problem is, as the United States was helping the British, it became clear that by late 1940, the British did not have enough money to pay for U.S. war material. So therefore, in late 1940 as well, Franklin Roosevelt used one of his fireside chats. And he used it to encourage Americans to support more aid for the British without any strings attached. And this would eventually lead, after much acrimonious debate in Congress, to the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941. What the Lend-Lease Act of March 1941 did was, it authorized the president to provide weapons and other supplies to the Allied powers. Well, over the course of the next 4 years, until the end of World War II, the United States sent Great Britain, the Soviet Union, France, China, and its other allies over $50 billion. As I like to do, I want to translate that into current currency, into current American dollars. $659 billion. That would be in today's money. So as you can see, a massive sum of money that the United States, even after it became physically involved after December 7th, 1941, we see the United States putting a lot of money into this war. Well, you also see the U.S. government relying on essentially propaganda to convince Americans that they should get involved in this war. And one of the individuals that the United States turned to carry out this propaganda campaign was a well-known cartoonist. And that cartoonist was Dr. Seuss of the children's books. And as you can see this image on the right here, ho-hum, no chance of contagion, it says at the bottom. What a lucky thing, we've got separate beds. We see Uncle Sam saying in his bed, which is right next to Europe, which as you can see is dealing with the problem of Stalin. Adolf Hitler. Stalin was, of course, the premier of the Soviet Union. The Blitz, the German Blitz, was carried out in 1941 and almost succeeded in destroying Great Britain. Nazi fever, fascist fever. Below that, we see Italian mumps in reference to Italy and Mussolini, who was another ally of Hitler. Basically, what we see Dr. Seuss doing in this political cartoon is saying, wake up, America. The Atlantic Ocean is not that big of a barrier between what is happening in Europe and what is happening in the United States. Eventually, this image is saying the United States will have to deal with that problem in Europe because it is not that far away. Well, despite all this propaganda, despite Franklin Roosevelt talking about America becoming, in his famous quote, an arsenal of democracy, and therefore needing to build up these items, but yet keep American boys off the ground, American boys would eventually arrive, of course, in Europe, and that was a direct result of the events that happened on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, killing 2,403 men. But I want to talk about why this attack happened, because so much of the world's attention and U.S. attention was in fact what was going on in Europe. Adolf Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin. At least initially, Stalin was part of the Axis powers before June of 1941 when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. But another part of that Axis powers was, of course, Japan. So why did Japan turn its attention to the United States? Well, in mid-1941, Japan took control of Indochina. Indochina included another country that we're going to be talking about in a future class, Vietnam. But nonetheless, by taking control of Indochina in 1941, Japan also gained access and control over that region's vast rubber resources. So as a result of this, the United States, who needed those rubber resources to prepare for war and provide all these weapons and other goods to these other allied powers, the United States basically froze Japanese financial assets that were in America. And more than that, it restricted oil exports to Japan. The United States was actually one of the leading exporters of oil prior to the end of World War II, so this was a big deal. Therefore, to show their anger and displeasure with the United States, the Japanese decided that they were going to attack Pearl Harbor, and thus, unexpectedly, the United States would actually get into World War II and physically fight, and thus ending isolationism in America, at least for the most part. You'd still have those elements on the fringes of society saying America should not become involved in this war, but for the most part, patriotism reigned supreme, and Americans gladly sacrificed for their country. The arsenal of democracy. That was a term or the phrase that I mentioned Franklin Roosevelt had used to encourage Americans to support the United States using its industrial might to produce items for the Allies. And in fact, that's what this war, particularly after the United States became involved in it, became a war for the expansion and the preservation of democracy against the fascist and totalitarian threats of Italy, Germany, and Japan. But in reality, as happened so much throughout U.S. history during times of war, we see as there's talk about expansion of democracy abroad, it is actually constricted and diminished at the home front. And this was the case for many groups, but I'm going to focus on one in particular in this lecture, and that was the Japanese Americans. So we're going to talk about the origins here to begin with of these concentration camps that were set up in the United States during World War II to deal with the perceived threat that these Japanese Americans pose to American security. In 1934, Franklin Roosevelt had asked the State Department to look into possible sabotage and spying by ethnic Japanese. Move ahead 5 years. In September 1939, Franklin Roosevelt asked the U.S. Army and U.S. Navy intelligence units to surveil Japanese along the Pacific coast of the United States, and he also called on the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, to track them. Well, following December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, 770 Japanese nationals were detained by the FBI. Moreover, Japanese, along with Germans and Italians, numbering some 890,000, were eventually designated as enemy aliens, and this meant that they faced travel restrictions. They also could not possess weapons, cameras, photographs of military installations, or shortwave radios. So what we have here already in 1939 is early efforts at surveilling and tracking them, some detainment, and then finally mass restrictions by December of 1941. But this would all be nothing compared to what we're going to see happen in 1942 with Executive Order 9066. And here's the thing. This is so disheartening to talk about because 30,000 Japanese Americans would actually be fighting for the United States in World War II. But despite this brave patriotism of these 30,000 Japanese Americans, many of them found their families would face dire circumstances at home, all because of, on February 19, 1942, Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. What this executive order did was, it authorized the Secretary of War to set up relocation camps. The following month, a military commander declared that Americans of Japanese descent, even second-generation Japanese who were born in the United States, were, in his words, subversive, and therefore, what we see the United States doing here is blaming the Japanese for placing ethnicity before nation. As a result of this, these Japanese Americans were rounded up from across the country, primarily California, but you'd see hotspots across the nation, and they were brought to internment camps. These 110,000 Japanese Americans were brought to internment camps located in California, Idaho, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, Arizona, and Arkansas. And you can see the different names of these camps listed on the screen here, where these 110,000 Japanese Americans were sent. But here's the other point. There were also Germans, 5,000 of them, and a far fewer number of just 300 Italians that were also sent to these so-called relocation camps, but in essence were concentration camps. Now, one of the most prominent of these concentration camps was the one at Manzanar in Southern California. And this is the one that I want to talk about as being one of the most difficult for the U.S. government to maintain control over, to contain this supposed threat of the Japanese Americans. Before we get to that, though, I want to talk about very briefly here, what it was like to live in these camps for these Japanese Americans. Once in the camps, each family received about a 20 square foot of floor space in uninsulated cabins. Now you might think, okay, California, not too bad, but keep in mind that this means it also does not keep the heat out. So we're talking about 100-degree temperatures that these families have to go through and bear with while they're in these uninsulated cabins. They were also given an iron cot to sleep on, along with a blanket for each family members. Once in these camps, families raised their own crops and livestock for food. Prisoners would also open stores, laundries, and clinics, while also publishing newspapers and creating cemeteries for those family members who died in these camps. Well, not surprisingly, tensions ran high in these areas. For instance, in Manzanar, we would see this camp alone housing about 10,000 people. And in the event that I want to talk about, which took place in December 1942, 4 prisoners beat up a suspected informant. And basically, it was not uncommon for the U.S. government to hire these informants that basically walked around these camps looking for any efforts at insurrection by the Japanese Americans who were being held. Well, these 4 prisoners beat up a suspected informant in December 1942, which led to 1 arrest. Well, following this arrest, a group of prisoners demanded his release. And this would eventually lead to the guards firing into the crowd that was fighting for this man's release, and 2 men were killed as a result of these police actions. Following this incident, martial law was implemented, which included the censorship of the newspapers, as newspapers were quite prominent in these locations. Nonetheless, we clearly have here a people, the Japanese Americans, who do not want to be held. They are being held against their will in these concentration camps, all the while the United States is supposedly fighting for the expansion of democracy abroad. As in World War I, it took a while before U.S. troops actually set foot on the battlefield. In this case, American troops would not begin fighting until November of 1942. And this occurred when the British and American forces landed in northern Africa to push out Rommel and his German troops. And what we will see during this time is, led by Dwight Eisenhower and George Patton, 2 well-known U.S. generals, the Allied forces defeated Germany and Italy by the following May in 1943. Now, here's an important piece that I want to pick up about this, and a theme that I'm going to be focusing a lot in this last little bit of lecture. And that is the fact that the United States, when they entered World War II, would become part of the Allies. And the other allies included, most importantly, the British, but also the Soviet Union, who, after being invaded in June of 1941 by Germany, who was their ally, the Soviet Union sided with the Allies. They left the Axis and joined the Allied powers. Well, what we're going to see is mutual suspicions arise, with the United States and Great Britain on one side versus the Soviet Union on the other. Why am I bringing this up? Because this will lead directly to the foundation of the Cold War that we're going to be talking about after World War II. So I want to be clear here. You could argue, as some historians do, that the Cold War actually began even as this other war, World War II, was still raging. But nonetheless, to get back to my point, this decision by the United States and Great Britain to focus on North Africa and, in essence, protect British colonies and British territory in the Mediterranean region, rather than help the Soviet Union in its life and death fight against German forces, really created a feeling of distrust between Churchill, the British Prime Minister, Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States, on the one hand, and then Stalin of the Soviet Union on the other. Finally, during a conference between British and American officials in Casablanca in early 1943, it was decided that the next target would be Italy. So here we have another step and another time that the United States and Great Britain basically says to the Soviet Union, hold tight, we want to deal with something else before we're going to come and back you up. So thus, once again, delaying a cross-channel invasion that the Soviets wanted to, again, take some of the pressure off of them, forcing Germany to go westward to deal with a cross-channel invasion from Great Britain over to France. Well, eventually, by late 1943, particularly at Tehran, Iran, in November of 1943, Franklin Roosevelt Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin met to discuss this cross-channel invasion. And finally, after much strenuous debate, it was decided that Operation Overlord would take place in May of 1944, the cross-channel invasion from Great Britain across the English Channel to France. However, due to rough waters and fog, the invasion of France by the Allied forces was postponed until June 6, 1944, in what has become known as D-Day. On this day, you can see this image on the right, and if any of you have ever seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, most historical movies lack accuracy. I should say fictional historical movies lack accuracy, but Saving Private Ryan is actually quite realistic at how bloody and deadly this incursion was for U.S. troops and Allied troops. Because what we will see is 60,000 soldiers storm the beaches of Normandy, and in the process 2,000 would die. But it would be a success because this would lead to the charge moving across across France, eventually allowing for Paris to be liberated in August of 1944. Well, in the preparations that were being carried out for the invasion of Germany and the eventual defeat of Hitler, the Allied planes would carpet bomb Germany, killing as many as 400,000 civilians in the process. So I bring this up just to again show you how deadly this war was and how both sides, the Allied powers and the Axis powers, were not afraid to kill civilians in the fight for their cause. And we see that with these carpet bombings, killing as many as 400,000 civilians in this war. I want to now, as you can see, talk about the end of this war. And this is an iconic image here from April 1945, the meeting at the Elbe. We'll describe the run-up to that in a second, but I say it's iconic because here you can clearly see the man in the middle is clearly a Soviet soldier, and his arms are around these two Allied troops, American troops, as they meet at the Elbe in Germany. Because this will be the last brief fleeting moment when the two sides, the Soviet Union and the United States, will actually be able to come together, because for the next 45 odd years, these two nations, as I alluded to earlier, will be gripped in this Cold War where they'll become mortal enemies. But let's talk about this. And we see again the origins of the Cold War already during the end of World War II, particularly at a Yalta conference in February 1945. So here you have the big three again: Joseph Stalin, Franklin Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill, meeting at Yalta near the Black Sea in Russia. Stalin was adamant during this meeting about maintaining control over Eastern Europe. Why? He wanted Eastern Europe to serve as a buffer against future invasions, particularly by Germany. Both in World War I and World War II, the Soviet Union, Russia, was invaded by Germany through Eastern Europe. So as a result of that, we see an effort here to use this as a buffer and therefore keep future invasions from happening. Well, Franklin Roosevelt conceded to this demand, given that the Soviets already physically controlled several of these countries, and because, more importantly, America needed the Soviet Union to help fighting the Japanese. It was also determined that Germany would be split into two countries, with America and Britain controlling West Germany and the Soviet Union controlling East Germany. Berlin, located in East Germany and the capital of Germany, would also be split. So in short, what we are seeing here is again the beginnings of two Europes and the beginning of the Cold War, with Europe itself being split between communists and sort of democracy, and Germany, West Germany and East Germany, being split up into communism and democracy. But nonetheless, by April of 1945, American and Soviet troops would meet at the Elbe, though Stalin made sure that it was Soviet troops that first conquered Berlin and defeated Hitler, so he could take the praise and achieve any sort of awards that come with that. But nonetheless, we still have another part of the war that we'll be talking about, and that, of course, is the Japanese theater, which again has connotations for the future Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. But we, in fact, will leave that battle, the battles that take place in that theater, for the next class as we tie it in to the Cold War more specifically.